Hello and welcome to Dialogue ASEAN. I'm your host, Fahana Sheh. Now, there's been a major global political shift in the world as of late, and to add spice to all this is the re-election or return of President Donald Trump to the United States as president. And at a time where Malaysia assumes its chairmanship of ASEAN 2025, navigating turmoil, tensions, issues within the region as well as abroad. So let's unpack all this with our guests for today. We have Professor Danny Quah from Lee Ka-shing Professor in Economics and Dean at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy Singapore, Thomas Daniel, Senior Fellow of Foreign Policy and Security Studies Program from ISIS Malaysia, as well as Professor Farish Noor, Professor at Faculty of Social Sciences, Universitas Islam International, Indonesia. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us today.
Thank you
Right.
for having us.
We want to address the biggest elephant in the room first before we get into ASEAN. A second Trump administration. Would it be significantly different, in terms of its treatment of foreign policy or in terms of its treatment when it comes to its ASEAN counterpart? Let's unpack this with Professor Quah first.
Well, thank you, Farana. It's a great pleasure to be here and get to speak to you and the other panelists. On Trump's second administration, the second presidency, it will continue to be an America first kind of presidency. It'll be MAGA all over again. And I think there's a lot of people focused on that but I want to say that that's actually not the appropriate focus of attention, because every nation wants to put themselves first. Every nation ought to want to be great, whether they're great again or continue to be great. Every nation should be that. Nobody gets out there and says, oh, please make my nation a lesser nation. So what Trump is doing here is just what everybody else would want to do. I think from ASEAN, the things that we need to watch out for in this second administration are not what is said about America being great again, but how Trump and his administration seeks to achieve their goals. What are the instruments they want to use, and what measures along the way are they targeting? I think many of us in Asia feel that Trump is someone who is familiar to us. He emphasizes transactionalism. He has no time for high liberal ideals about democracy or about internationalism. He's after making a deal, and we in Asia love to make deals too. So at first it seems like he is the president for us. But I think what we need to do is to reflect a bit on how ideals like democracy or liberal values, we might not buy into them, all of us as Asians, but what they have done from the perspective of America is that they have come out in support of a level playing field, a level playing field that has allowed us in ASEAN, smaller economies, less developed economies, to get a foot in the door. They were allowed to trade. Trump's administration is likely to use America's power and resources against this kind of openness and multilateralism. So it is a transactionalism that we in Asia, we in ASEAN, do need to be concerned about. We can get into tariffs and other trade policy later, but my point here is that this is something that ought to be of great concern to us, not because we think his values are not anything we care about, but because those values that he espouses will potentially be used to disrupt the international system in a way that makes it more difficult for the rest of us.
Right. I mean, you mentioned a key word there, tariffs, and I do want to get to that. But let's look at, I understand, since the inauguration on the 20th, there hasn't been a lot of, foreign policy talks. But just anticipating it a bit further, right? When it comes to Trump's approach in Southeast Asia or ASEAN particularly, there's been critics before of Trump's administration lack of engagement with ASEAN bloc as a whole. Can we anticipate that in the second administration, or will it be a bit more, can we prepare ourselves more when it comes to dealing with another Trump administration? Maybe Prof. Farish, if you care to join in.
Okay, well, first of all, can I just say that I don't quite share Danny's optimism here, but I think when we look at what's about to happen in the United States, there is a tendency to somehow present Trump as a kind of anomaly, as if there is something novel about Trump, and actually that's not the case. For those who have followed American politics, this is a trend. This is the culmination of a trend that goes back to the 80s, to the time of Reagan. It goes back to the rise of people like Newt Gingrich. And there has been this shift towards the Republican Party in particular, becoming increasingly isolationist and putting America first. Now, of course, like Professor Danny said, all countries would do that. And the Democrats in America have also done that. They've always put America first. The difference is the kind of transactionalism that we have seen during the first term of Trump is one that puts aside the very constructivist approach that has been, practiced in international relations, the need for negotiation, working together, above all, the respect for international law and rule of law. Which I think is of little consequence as far as Trump is concerned. Now, as far as ASEAN is concerned, let's remember, during Trump's first term, the Trump establishment, and it's not just Trump, it's the people around him as well, have not demonstrated a keen awareness or desire to even acknowledge ASEAN. I mean, this is a president who, during his term, did not attend U.S. ASEAN summits, did not, only hosted one, I believe, ASEAN meeting. And so where does ASEAN stand in the midst of all this? Now, to go back to the point made earlier by Danny, when nations put their national interests first, everything else, all other nations, all other regions, therefore only mean anything. They only have any worth when they contribute to the greatness of that nation. So then, as far as ASEAN is concerned, ASEAN is only important if it helps America. And if it doesn't serve America's interests, then ASEAN will be neglected. And remember, America has a long history of neglecting its former allies. Pakistan was neglected for decades when it was regarded as not being useful anymore after the end of the Cold War. And so these are things that we need to actually be aware of. And in that context, then, if we don't figure prominently in America's mainstream political discourse, then the talk about threats of tariffs or protectionism, they become glib. They become very easy to do because we don't loom large in their calculations. And I think this is something that people like us in ASEAN, have to be aware of. And so while transactionalism will be the norm during this term, I think the net results, as far as ASEAN's collective interests are concerned, are not guaranteed at any point.
Right. So I guess drawing on that, that's a good segue to one of the key proposal in Trump's administration, which would be tariffs. He announced tariff, particularly a biggie when it comes to tariffs on China. What's the broader implication here for ASEAN nations of this tariff? How badly or will it have a significant impact on us? And how should we prepare for potential economic shocks from this move? Maybe Professor Kwok, maybe you can chime in.
Yeah, I'm happy to come back in. Trump has a view of the world on tariffs that's comprised of 2 points. The first point is that tariffs, when America imposes them, will be paid for by someone else. Mm-hmm. So that's his first position. The second point is that he has a view of how America does relative to the rest of the world that's based on just a few very simple statistics. Leading among them is, does America have a trade surplus or a trade deficit against that country? And in Trump's thinking, if America runs a surplus against you, America is winning. If America runs a deficit against you, it is losing. So those 2 points make him think, I will use tariffs to correct trade imbalances, and that will make sure that America wins. So there's a self-consistent view of the world in this way. The question is, how does ASEAN figure in this? Because within ASEAN, some countries like Singapore runs a deficit against America bilaterally. So America looks at Singapore and says, you're one of the good guys because I'm winning against you. Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, on the other hand, America runs deficits against them. So will America seek to impose tariffs on them to try and correct this imbalance? Of course, the big tariff target is China. China is the one that Trump has his sights on economically in this regard. And in this regard, there are those who feel that this is a way for the rest of us to come in good on this. Because if America targets China, it takes its eyes off of us. The fact that he ignores ASEAN might then play to our advantage because whatever China is no longer able to export to America, the rest of us can do. This is sometimes known as a China plus one strategy, that all the rest of us are plus ones. It's also known as chain washing. We're using the global supply chain to cleanse the exports that come out of China that head to America, on which Trump is targeting. Now, this is a dangerous game to play. So, in terms of what ASEAN needs to do, my sense is it needs to step away from this kind of gaming, from this kind of China plus one chain washing. It is simple as day for policymakers in America to quickly realize that someone in ASEAN is simply being a conduit for Chinese exports to go to America. And then the full weight of American iron falls upon us. ASEAN needs to step aside from this great power competition and set up its own store, as it were, tell its own journey, have a centrality that works for itself, that's not refracted through the lens of America's actions against China. So on this, I would urge extreme caution that we don't get caught in the crosshairs of this great power competition. America has concerns about China that well transcend trade alone. America feels that China's rise will continue to advance the emergence of a hostile hegemon whose ascendancy will sharply constrain America's freedom of actions in this region. That's a story that's got nothing to do with trade. It's about great power competition. We in ASEAN need to establish a narrative for ourselves that takes us out of that. And if we can actually try and help the two understand each other better, so they no longer view each other in that confrontational way. But one thing we should not do is to try and think we can take advantage of US-China competition. So my thinking about ASEAN is we do have a story. We need to tell our story. We need to remove it from the front lines of US-China confrontation.
Right. I mean, I see Prof. Arish and Thomas both nodding their heads, either agreeing or thinking a bit more further about this ASEAN centrality and ASEAN's own narrative. So let's talk about ASEAN here and its framework and its issues. Let's first start with, well, Malaysia. Thomas, Malaysia is the chairman of ASEAN Bloc this year. What are some of the realistic expectations for Malaysia's leadership in pushing for especially unity among ASEAN members in such a tough, difficult, challenging time for us right now?
Sure. Well, look, ASEAN likes to talk about centrality quite a bit, whereas I think unity and cohesion is the aspect that ASEAN should really be focusing on. Is always more difficult to have unity and cohesion when you have 10, soon to be 11 member states. And all of these states, have their own national interests, their own regional interests, their own priorities, and they don't always jive with sort of broader regional interests. I think to be realistic is also to be pragmatic. And I think pragmatism has been a real hallmark of Malaysian foreign policy for the most part. And I think it will continue to drive our approach here. You'll hear a lot of Malaysians, not just me, using the word pragmatism this year. And I think we have to be smart in our diplomacy and in our engagements to try and find middle grounds between these diverging interests. But I feel that it is a particular challenge, and not just for Malaysia this year, but for prior chairs and for chairs to come. That is the reality that we face.
Right. So on that, let's look at some of the key issues when it comes to, within the ASEAN region itself. Let's start with Myanmar. We've closed the chapter on the US just now, but we'll revisit that at the end. Let's look at Myanmar first. How should Malaysia actually approach the ongoing crisis in Myanmar as, leading the bloc this time around? While also balancing ASEAN's principle of non-interference. This is an ongoing conversation that we have, I feel, almost every year. Prof. Farish, do you mind sharing with us a little bit of input when it comes to addressing this ongoing crisis and Malaysia's role as, the leader of ASEAN this time around?
Well, I think first and foremost, one thing that needs to be emphasized for any country that becomes a member of an organization like ASEAN is that once you do become a member of that organization, then in a sense, whatever issues you have, whatever problems you have are no longer your own. They become part of the collective. And even though ASEAN from the beginning, ASEAN is not the EU. It's not a legal body. There's no ASEAN court. There's no ASEAN, process to bring people to justice or what have you. And it was never intended to do that. It's a child of the Cold War, and the aim of ASEAN, as we know, was to maintain peace and harmony in the region, with the emphasis on maintaining trade, as a means of engagement between member nation states. But when you have issues like what's been happening in Myanmar over the past few years, like it or not, it becomes our problem as well. And this is how ASEAN will be judged. This is how ASEAN is seen. So we need to be aware of perceptions, perceptions among the people of ASEAN themselves and other countries outside ASEAN. To go back to the point I raised earlier about whether ASEAN looms large in the calculations of not only Washington, but other governments in the West or in Africa or in South America. The constant complaint, the running complaint that we've heard for more than a decade now is that ASEAN can't get its act together. And that's because things like this happen. And ASEAN issues, of course, cautionary remarks, admonitions, or what have you, but nothing changes on the ground. And that only feeds into this narrative that ASEAN is either redundant or it's weak or it's actually culpable. It's not actually doing anything. And that doesn't help ASEAN in the long run. But if you're going to address that, we also have to remember that ASEAN is a very different kind of tool. Like I said, it's not the EU. It doesn't have the means to intervene in other countries. If you want to talk about the principle of non-intervention, that's another discussion altogether. But let's look at what we have. Now, what we have is a mechanism that allows for dialogue between states, but that's been the strength of ASEAN, but also its weakness, because it's an inter-elite, intergovernmental a grouping, if you like, and it has almost no resonance on the ground level. How many people in Southeast Asia feel that they are ASEAN citizens? How many people in Southeast Asia feel that they belong to Southeast Asia? And this is for me a tragedy. I mean, let me put it this way: ASEAN was created in 1967. We still have not been able to come up with something as simple as a common history textbook for Southeast Asian students at primary school level. And so while we live next to one another, we don't actually know one another at all. at all. And that's true for most of us. I mean, I'm not sure whether you know your neighbors. I don't know my neighbors, and we can live next to each other, and we don't know anything about our different political systems. The countries in Southeast Asia are very, very complex, and they're very different structurally, but we don't know one another, and our communities don't know one another. So if you're going to talk about ASEAN unity or common purpose or what have you, or even ASEAN centrality, we need to start from the basics. And I think we've neglected this for decades, and the price of it is what we are seeing today.
So what I'm getting at is this ASEAN identity that is missing in the narrative when it comes to talking about, how we can be more cohesive, how can we be more unified, how can we sort of identify ourselves as members of ASEAN that actually can work together. Am I right, Prof. Harish?
Well, yes, but let's not confuse coming together with unity in terms of singularity. We cannot be a singularity. We are politically, structurally, economically, culturally, linguistically so diverse that we are not one nation. We're not one people. But in the same way that Europe could actually develop a sense of Europeanness while maintaining a sense of national identity, you just because you're European doesn't mean you stop being French. You don't stop being a Dutch person. You don't stop being a German. Likewise, you can be a Malaysian and a member of ASEAN, an Indonesian and a member of ASEAN, a Singaporean and a member of ASEAN. But for some weird reason, we seem to think that you can't have both. If you feel that you're ASEAN, you somehow lose your national identity, and surely that's bunkum. That's nonsense. You can we multitask all the time. I'm a husband and a father at the same time. When I'm a father, I don't stop being a husband, right? So we can multitask at the same time, and yet we are not doing it, and that's largely because so much of the discussion about ASEAN has been led basically by state elites and corporate elites. Where are the people of ASEAN? And if they're missing from this, you can't get your project going. And I'm sorry, just to go back to Trump, whatever you think about Trump, one thing Trump managed to do was he managed to win the discourse. He managed to bring a substantial number of the American public onto his project, whatever that project might be. That's how you conduct campaigns like this. You need to bring your public together. We still haven't been able to do that. And so now when ASEAN tries to talk to the world and say, look, we can do certain things, we can actually bring about peace and stability in our region, the evidence that we see on a daily basis in the news doesn't seem to support that claim. And that's the worrying thing for me.
Right, so it's this ASEAN-ness that is a bit missing in the discourse, I feel.
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I know you want to move on to something else, but I wanted to address, if I may, an issue that you raised here about ASEAN and Myanmar in particular.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about, on the one hand, principles, and on the other hand, real-world stresses. I think the principle of non-interference is a wonderful one. It's one that we should not give up lightly. Those who have sacrificed it have often done it for purposes that are less than noble. So invasion of foreign nations, forgetting about territorial integrity and national sovereignty is something that rogue nations have used against others to steal their territory. So that we in ASEAN have made the principle of non-interference a strong central plank in the way in which we deal with one another is actually one of the wonderful things about ASEAN. So, and we have to remember also that ASEAN came into the situation they were in, as friends of mine from Malaysia like to emphasize, not necessarily for love of one another, but out of fear of the outside. Because we came together, I think, one of the other panelists mentioned early on, we came together at a time when Richard Nixon from the United States said that the states of Southeast Asia need to take up for themselves the responsibility of safeguarding their own security. It is not for the United States anymore to serve as an umbrella insurance agent for any of us. So we came together to protect each other. And we did this because of a fear of then another great power, China. China had just come through a horrible period in its history. Cultural revolution, great leap forwards. Hundreds of millions of its own people were killed in city streets. There was starvation, there was cannibalism, there was rampant purges. The whole place was in chaos. Was a nation of 700 million people in chaos. That's not a pleasant scene to try and countenance. And after that, when China did get its act together, what did it do? But try to export communist revolution. So in Southeast Asia, we regularly got broadcasts from Kunming about how China was supporting communist revolution throughout our sovereign territory. That was not a good place to be, and that we have come so far, carrying forward just the principle of non-interference and ASEAN centrality is a wonderful credit to ASEAN. It's an amazing journey that ASEAN has been on. But as other panelists have said, this is showing stresses, and part of the stresses are external ones. When we think about Myanmar and we think, oh, is this a blot on the face of ASEAN? Why isn't it fixed? We also have to recognize that there are external forces at work here. India is not at all comfortable with continuing chaos in Myanmar. It sees the possibility of millions, scores of millions of Myanmar people streaming across the border and causing disruption in India. And it wants this problem fixed. We in ASEAN need to come up with a way in which we meld a wonderful principle of non-interference, national sovereignty, with the early principle that we need to protect ourselves all together from external disruptions. And that is the great challenge, it seems to me. We've also got all the problems of ASEAN identity. I completely agree with my colleagues on this panel, but we have an immediate problem to fix. And we need to, I hope, under the Anwar presidency, under the Malaysia presidency, make some progress on this.
Farhan, I'm going
Yes,
to jump in on Myanmar as well.
about to ask you, but go ahead.
Sure. Look, I think non-interference is out of the window. Non-interference has gone out the window when what is happening in Myanmar has started to affect its regional neighbors, right?
Yes.
It's affecting Thailand, it's affecting Indonesia, it's affecting non-ASEAN member states like Bangladesh, China, India, it's affecting Malaysia. And mind you, these issues predate the coup in Feb 2021. A lot of them go back decades. You have Myanmar refugees in Malaysia who are in their third generation, meaning their grandparents came to Malaysia as refugees, and now they have grandkids who are refugees in Malaysia. Now, I think the position that Malaysia and Indonesia and also others like Singapore adopts is one of non-indifference, right? So non-interference does not, non-interference does not mean non-indifference to what's happening in your country. And I think other ASEAN member states should bear it in mind, because ASEAN is clearly extremely fractured on Myanmar. And like it or not, as Farish said, our reputation is at stake, not just with external stakeholders, but with our own, our own people, the citizens of ASEAN, which ASEAN always likes to claim to represent. That being said, Farish is also right. There are institutional shackles on the way that ASEAN operates, that ASEAN is allowed to function. So is it fair to ask a question, is it fair to expect ASEAN to deal with some of these challenges when it's institutionally shackled to what its founders intended back in the 70s? So these are really difficult questions for ASEAN, but it's something that ASEAN leaders need to get serious about, especially on Myanmar, and not just wish that the problem will go away in a few years, like what most of them have been doing. And I hope that member states will seriously, will start taking this seriously. As for what Malaysia could do, well, I think, I hope that they would use our chairmanship here to push for more multi-stakeholder, multi-track dialogues, to push that the special envoy be a permanent setup in ASEAN, instead of just passing it down from one member state to the other. And I hope that there are plans. The junta has announced plans for elections later this year in November, and I hope that both Malaysia and ASEAN push back strongly, like we did in 2022. You need to achieve peace. You need to achieve some sort of political settlement on the ground before you actually go for elections. Thankfully, the statements by FM seem to point in this direction. So let's see.
Right. I mean, Thomas, you're taking the questions right off my notes here, because that's exactly what I wanted to ask you. Because, we see the spillover effects in Malaysia when you said about Myanmar refugees just now. We see this spillover effect in other neighboring countries as well. And yes, we do have to navigate this limitation with Malaysia's chairmanship this year. So thank you so much for that input. Another contentious issue when it comes to the ASEAN bloc is obviously the South China Sea. We have seen an ASEAN push for a code of conduct in the South China Sea, but the situation at hand is still very much, I wouldn't say no progress, but I would say very slow progress when it comes to tackling the issue. But how can ASEAN push for more decisive action or decisive dialogue when it comes to addressing the South China Sea issue, especially under Malaysia's chairmanship? Maybe anyone can take this?
Sure. I can give it a go. Look, we have seen statements from ASEAN that have said repeatedly they want an expedited conclusion to the code of conduct. Supposedly, there's been a deadline set for 2026, but I think we should wait for the official text of the code of conduct to be released before assessing its ultimate value or its effectiveness. I am personally rather skeptical that it will result in outcomes that might offer tangible benefits to ASEAN claimants, but I would be happy to be proven wrong. I think ASEAN can't decisively address this dispute because not all member states are party to the dispute or prioritize to the dispute. Is it logical to expect, a country that has no stake whatsoever in the South China Sea dispute to give the same degree of importance to it as countries that are claimant states? Some states like Cambodia and Myanmar have actively acted at China's behest to water down ASEAN statements and concerns on the South China Sea. So this will be a huge challenge to Malaysia as it is to all ASEAN chairs. Well, for Malaysia, additional pressure this year. We are not only chair, we are also the country coordinator for China until for the next couple of years. So this will be something that Malaysia will have to see through with China. Perhaps I think something pragmatic that Malaysia can focus on when it comes to the South China Sea, when it comes to ASEAN member states, is to, especially the claimant states, is to work to rebuild trust among ASEAN member states broadly and claimant states in particular, right? People, don't forget, this is not a dispute between ASEAN claimants and China. All ASEAN member states have disputes with each other. And in the case of Malaysia, it goes back longer than our dispute with China. So I think we underestimate the level of distrust among ASEAN claimant states, and we forget this history, and we tend to focus too much on the issue of China.
Prof. Farish, if you can add on a little bit, we talked about some of these issues having more importance to certain nations than others, but when it comes to the way ASEAN approach things, it's more consensus driven. It's more, non-interference, centrality, and all that mumbo jumbo. So do you think it actually hinders the ability to actually address critical regional issues? And if you can add on, how can Malaysia actually navigate this limitation?
Well, there's mumbo and there's also jumbo, and this is the language of politics. And I think here we need to be able to discern and read between the lines or behind the lines here, because this is the praxis of politics, and much of political praxis, especially diplomatic praxis, works through language. However, Thomas's point earlier is, I think, hugely important, because when we talk about the South China Sea, and Thomas is entirely right, not all states. Laos, for example, is landlocked. So what has it got to do with Laos, right? So you have that. So how do you get member states to feel that they have a stake in something when they actually don't? And that's again part and parcel of membership of any group. to go back to Myanmar earlier, when you join something like ASEAN, it's not like joining Manchester United Football Club or whatever. You're buying into a package of values and praxis that will have to then somehow have an impact, an effect on the way you conduct your politics domestically and regionally and internationally. Now, to do that, again, this consensus, if it's consensus that is merely reiterated at every ASEAN summit, then again, we are only at the level of language. The sad thing is that if you look back to the region's history, the very same states today that are at loggerheads, with China in particular, have in the past also, gone unilateral and chosen to work with China when if it suits their interests. And so we don't have a credible record, to be honest, of countries behaving consistently over time. So there've been times when certain ASEAN countries said, okay, fine, we'll go our own way with China. Now, China, of course, doesn't want to deal with ASEAN as a whole, but wants to deal with us on a country-by-country basis. And this is where, again, ASEAN centrality and ASEAN, unity comes in. Again, it doesn't make us singular, it doesn't make us homogenous, but we need to be able to speak with one common voice. So what is Malaysia to do? I think, every head of ASEAN, every chair of ASEAN, tries to do this, tries to deepen this sense of a common fate, a common future that we share together, whether we like it or not. And I think this is an ongoing process. And this is something that has to be intensified again and again. And it doesn't mean that you'll have a solution to the South China Sea problem, but we ought to be able to at least speak with a voice, an ASEAN voice, which, as Danny said earlier, has not really been articulated. What's ASEAN's stand on these matters? And as long as that's not articulated, again, it lends the impression that we are actually not something to be taken seriously. And I think that would be a tragedy, because ASEAN has been very successful at preventing war among its members for the last 60 years, for heaven's sakes. Only us and Europe. There are not many international organizations that have been able to do this, and we did it. So it's something that we can be proud of, but now we need to actually come together and find a means to have a common narrative.
Can I add to what my
Yes.
colleagues have said by maybe making three proposals? And there are different levels of abstraction. They're not as concrete as we must go to this island and fix it this way. But three seems to me sensible proposals that might have more attention paid to them. First is that we do need to act together.
Yeah.
This idea that speaking with one voice. I mean, even if not all of ASEAN is engaged in the same way. Like, let me speak up for my friends in Laos. They're landlocked, but they feel that peace in ASEAN is actually a good thing as well, as all of the rest of us agree. So they want a voice, and this is one of the hotspots of geopolitical contestation, the South China Sea is, and we need to lower the temperature in its discussion. That's vitally important for all the rest of us. So my first point is, let's lower the temperature. Let's recognize that everyone has a stake in this, everyone in this region, because peace in this region has been extremely consequential for our economic prosperity,
Exactly.
and we need to keep that. Second point is that, yes, there are competing claims, and the nature of competing claims is they're either a two-party or three-party contestation in a zero-sum kind of way. There's no such thing as a compromise that everyone's happy with. Someone has to give way in the hopes that they are compensated in some other way. We need to recognize that there's a zero-sum nature to the overlapping claims. And one of the ways in which the region, ASEAN, has been able to work with this is to say, let's put off that final determination. But in the meantime, there are lots of things we can work together that we can both benefit out of that.
Exactly.
So I say, it's my second principle, let's look for those mutual gains. Let's postpone that zero-sum contestation for which there will be no happy outcome. But in the meantime, we can do a lot of good. And in doing this, we need to call out double standards and hypocrisy. True, China is the competing claimant. True, China has built emplacements and military installations and islands, but so have the rest of us. Everyone who's got some stake in the South China Sea
Yeah.
has done similar things. So we need to be clear about double standards, and we need to remove elements of foreign interference. Okay. I see, when I travel, I see members of ASEAN pushing on parts of the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea in ways that seem to me totally inappropriate relative to the size and stature and the economic wealth of that country. I look at that and I see areas where people seem to be actively challenging other claimants for almost violent reaction. We need to, as a group, work to make sure to lower the temperature, remove these elements of foreign interference. So I make some suggestions that I think if we can take forwards, that will be a good starting point until we can get the code of conduct written and made transparent, and everyone can agree to that.
I mean, I think those are great suggestion points. And if I can add my 2 cents to it, let's just call a spade a spade. ASEAN don't get high scores when it comes to probably solving conflicts, but it's good at lowering temperatures, like you mentioned just now. It's good at, with its limitation, with its, many concepts, non-interference, centrality. It's good at not getting into wars, like Prof. Faris said. So let's call a spade a spade. Let's touch on one more thing that I want to circle back, which is another principle, neutrality, especially when it comes to the US-China tensions and, how do we balance that when it comes to ASEAN as a bloc. Maybe, Prof. Faris, you can take this on. How, with simmering tensions right now and with Trump's second presidency, how can we expect ASEAN to navigate this new tensions between US and China while still maintaining ASEAN's neutrality?
Well, first of all, tensions are never new. Tensions are a constant in politics, especially in international politics. So that's something that we have to live with. And I think that's already built into the way ASEAN was created, right? Like I said, when it was first formed, formed in 1967, it was formed at the peak of the Cold War, at a very tense time in our region's history, and these built-in mechanisms, including the principle of non-interference, were precisely designed to prevent that. So tension has always been part and parcel of it. However, I think we need to understand one thing. When we're looking at tensions now, as Danny said earlier, they are external triggers, they're external stressors, and this is what we really need to worry about, because the temptation to walk into our backyard and turn it into some shooting gallery is just too great. We are unfortunately both blessed and cursed by our geography, and because of our geography, for hundreds of years, all the polities of Southeast Asia have thrived when there is peace. This is built into our political DNA. Even in the pre-colonial era, we thrived when there was peace because we are trading nations. We are fundamentally trading nations. There is not a single country in Southeast Asia that has any hegemonic pretensions or ambitions of any kind, and we know that. But we are dealing with people outside our backyard who want to come into our backyard and do a barbecue of their own. And I think this is where we need to draw the line. So how do we manage this? And we can only manage this if somehow we as a collective, can lay down our own standards. I mean, Danny's right earlier, about, pointing out the hypocrisies and double standards, when you talk about freedom of navigation, so on the one hand, people say, oh, we demand the freedom of navigation so that our Western ships can sail, right through Southeast Asia. Well, how would they feel if, a Chinese vessel just popped up in front of Los Angeles, in the name of, freedom of navigation? That's not, going to be taken lightly. So these sort of things, I mean, we are always passively on the receiving end. Yeah, and I think we need to also be more proactive in the way we raise these concerns. And for us to raise these concerns, in a credible and legible manner, I think that's where a kind of concert of nations is required here. The governments of Southeast Asia need to seriously sit down, look at the reality on the ground, recognize the fact that we are already in the midst of what is clearly a major contestation between two major rival economic powers, and this is where we are now. So let's play the game on this chessboard. These are the terms that we're going to have to work with, rather than dream of some ideal scenario that's actually not there.
Right. I mean, it's that foreign interference that we talked about just now, and looking at ASEAN as a cohesive, unified member that can deal with its problem and ensure that nobody interferes in what it's dealing with.
Just Farhana, I mean, yeah. not all of ASEAN's problems are ASEAN's problems. Some are other people's problems that have been imposed on us as well.
Yes,
we are not psychoanalysts to the planet. We're not here to deal with your personal political agendas and issues. So. Well, it's also time that we say, look, these are your concerns. This is your rivalry, your contestation, but don't drag us into this, because that's not what we are interested in. And I think that's important. We need to be able to actually take a stand once in a while.
Right.
To sort of build up on what Parish said, I'm going to paraphrase a much used and abused phrase, right? ASEAN may not be interested in the major powers or their rivalry, but they are certainly interested in our region, and we certainly don't have much of a choice here, but to adapt and to respond. I think when we think about these issues, I think aside from just thinking of our interests, ASEAN regional interests, ASEAN priorities, it would also be worth to sort of invest in trying to understand the motivations of major powers, of the United States under Trump, of China under Xi Jinping. How do they see themselves? How do they see their challenges, their priorities? Mm-hmm. And once you understand that, then maybe you can fit and adjust your national and your regional priorities to adapt that. This idea of going to the major powers and preaching to them about ASEAN values simply does not work. You will need to learn how to speak their language. You will need how to understand their interests and priorities, and then position yourself to be able to be a part of that, right? So they engage you because you have actual tangible value to their strategic interests as well, not just because you're this regional organization that has lasted for close to 70 years and you're a community and you've never had wars among your member states. That stuff does not work. And I think because the flavor of the day is the United States under the second Trump administration, we've had conversations about how transactional this will be, but I would caution, I would caution people out there. The second Trump administration is not going to be like the first Trump administration. Trump as an individual might be transactional, but the people around him in this round are not transactional. They are very ideological. Look at the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, look at the VP, look at the people who are going to be assuming positions of deputy secretaries, hugely influential positions that are that are not really appreciated outside the system. Look at the huge spate of resignations from the Department of State, of senior officials, and the incoming new appointments. These will all be political appointments. These are the guys who are going to be tasked not just to carry out national policies, but to carry out Trump, the political agenda of the Trump team, in countries that the US engage in. And this is critically important to understand. You need to understand the language that they speak, the terms that they use, and that's how you choose to engage with them. Because choosing not to engage with this United States under a Trump administration, that's problematic, and as it might be, choosing not to engage will be the worst option. I mean, a lot of people, the US, a lot of people talk about Chinese investment in Southeast Asia, but the Americans have invested heavily in Southeast Asia. 2 years ago, a cumulative American investment in Southeast Asia outnumbered their investment in China, Japan, Korea, India put together. Right? A lot of Southeast Asian countries, including countries that are very critical of the United States, depend hugely on security cooperation and partnership with the Americans. Southeast Asia, does not really want the Americans to disengage. What we want is a more collaborative, sort of a much more collaborative engagement that is not just predicated on a security lens or predicated on a lens of containing this power or that power.
I mean, Thomas, I think probably that's why we have you in ISIS Malaysia, to probably warn some of our stakeholders here in Malaysia as we assume our chairmanship.
Well, I wouldn't depend on me, so.
But right, okay, so on that, we're running out of time, but I just want to throw this question brief for all our three panelists here. Because Malaysia is the chairman of ASEAN in 2025, do you think we have what it takes to take on some of ASEAN's, internal divisions and also position itself as a key player in the global stage? What should, maybe Anwar be mindful of when it comes to navigating all these turmoils and tensions and all these issues that we discussed? Let's start with, in brief, Prof. Harish.
Whether we are ready or not, the fact is we have to, simple as that. Yeah, because time is not on our side. Time is never on our side. And for a country like Malaysia, that is very much a trading nation, that is very much vulnerable and dependent upon an external commercial, financial, economic environment that has to be stable, our stakes are very high. We have no choice. We must be proactive. Now, I think what this means is, leadership is required, and a vocal leadership, one that is, ideologically, politically, and morally consistent. I think that's what the region needs at the moment.
Prof. Kua?
I'm caught between a rock and a hard place. Because on the one hand, I think all of us in ASEAN and all in the rest of the world, we are so much better at managing our politics and managing relations with the rest of the world, being more aware. But at the same time this is happening, great power politics has become ever more important. And so we're sort of caught in between these tensions. People used to say, the great powers do what they will. The rest of us suffer what we must. Nothing we do affects the agency of the great powers. But of course, we've got, among all of us, sort of a rising agency. So how that balance plays out remains to be seen. But my word of caution here is, we're talking about this at a time when the new president of the United States brings a transactionalism that is quite tricky for all the rest of us to work with, because that transactionalism will unroll the level playing field of multilateralism that so many of us have leveraged to become powerful and prosperous on. Before I came into this conversation, I was worried that Trump's administration would be just like Trump. Now Thomas has said what he's done. I'm even more worried that Trump's administration will be worse than Trump. There's an ideological side to them that Trump doesn't have, but Trump himself, his version of how he deals with the world will already be difficult enough for all of the rest of us to try and navigate.
Right, Thomas, in brief, let's bring it home.
Okay, and I will really try to bring this home. Let's look at, I'm going to look at ASEAN. I'm not going to focus on the major powers, right? Something really important that's happening this year in our chairmanship is the ending of the ASEAN Vision Community 2025 and the commencement of Vision 2045. This is, within ASEAN context, this is significant, right? It's the next major step in our community building that will drive us forward for the next 20 years. Knowing a little bit about this process, Malaysia has had to sort of shepherd these conversations through over the last few years. And as you said, consensus is never easy, but we have managed to bring it this far. And Malaysia is expected to sort of see at least kickstart this process and see it through. And I think this is something that perhaps we probably will not get enough recognition for outside the sort of circles to sort of talk about this. This is pretty significant. So let's remember that it's also about us internally and not just all about major powers.
Right, there you have it. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for all your insights on what's to come for ASEAN 2025, for Malaysia, for member states, even for the US. interesting times, definitely challenging for all of us, but I think we will face it head on. Thank you so much for everyone at home for watching. I'm Farhana Sheikh. Thank you for watching.